Good afternoon. Welcome back to Oregon Conference Camp Meeting. This is I Serve 2020, and we're so glad that you're here to be with us. I am so excited about this next segment. We're going to be spending some time with Justin Khoe and Kaleb Eisele, and we're going to be talking about moving from content to connection. You know, as we have been going through this last 3 or 4 months of this pandemic, it's been amazing to see how people have been so excited about online content, but then they have moved away from that in some ways because the connection just isn't there. In this session, we're going to talk about some content and some ways that we can bring the connection back through social media. Here's how it's going to work. Kaleb and Justin have put together a piece of content that's about 25 minutes long or so. They have the teaching all assembled. We're going to roll that video in just a minute. And then after the video is complete, they will be live with me here in studio, and we will be able to talk about it, unpack it, and even take some of your questions. If you do want to ask questions, they have to be in a place where I can see them, which means find the Oregon Conference Facebook page or YouTube channel by commenting in the live comments there. I can see those and I can relay those to our guests. We're going to have a great time together. But first, let's roll the seminar.
Hey, in today's session, I'm here with Kaleb Eisele from Humans of Adventism, and we're going to be talking about how you can use the internet, social media, to actually create stronger, more meaningful, real-life bonds and connections with your church. Kaleb, thanks for hanging out with us today.
Yeah, definitely. So part of what brought this on is just this idea I've come across recently that the internet is kind of separate from our lives. Right? Like
there's real life, and then there's like internet, like kind of like Ready Player One. You plug in, or The Matrix, you plug in, and it's like, well, maybe this is real, maybe it's not, but it's distinctly different.
Yeah. So I think that maybe we have to get away from this idea that the internet is not real life, because the implications there are that the things you do on there don't matter as much, that maybe it's like a side thing to what we're actually doing, maybe even just a distraction from mission. And I would like to turn that on its head and say that this is probably the most powerful tool we have for mission right now.
I think that because of coronavirus, this might be the first time that we as the church are like, okay, tell me more. Because initially, like, we're super skeptical. Like, there's no way that what happens online is as meaningful as what happens, say, during the divine service or when we do community service. But now we're starting to realize the line has blurred, if not disappeared altogether. What happens online in many ways right now is actually what the church is doing.
Yeah. And if you don't have internet access, you can see that you're really barred in some ways from this ongoing conversation, maybe with your church and your faith community. It's really required us to have that. And I think this is a powerful time to learn, if you haven't already. Because a lot of us have lived in this for a while. We've been isolated as students. We've been isolated as people without a lot of money or transportation or whatever it is. And so now having the world come into kind of our online community has been exciting, but also, I think, challenging for people who haven't built this up.
I think just a testament to the idea how internet content can lead to real friendships and relationships. One testament of it, one among many, is the fact that you and I are here together in person, because just a couple of years ago, we were literally on opposite sides of the country doing separate things, doing different things, and we just met through the internet and became friends. And like, long story short, you end up coming here and being a part of our local conference and being a part of this movement of creating change here in Oregon. And it's been a beautiful thing. And I think what we're trying to say and what we're hoping to be able to explain here today is that that's not just a one-off case. That this can happen regularly with your church, with your community.
Yes.
Even if you're not like a famous, editor and writer for Humans of Adventism.
So I woke up to this fact actually several years ago when I was kind of new to church. I volunteered to take over my church's Facebook page, which was inactive. So I created the page. I, started posting regular content, inviting people to events and just sharing some things that were going on. And people started showing up at our church.
Now, real quick, for context, how large was this church? Where was this church?
Oh, tiny country church, South Carolina, traditional church, nothing fancy, no smoking and guitars.
Sure.
I mean,
Those fancy guitars.
Yeah. Just the kind of place that you don't think of when you think cool church.
Sure.
And yet people started showing up that we had never seen before. And so eventually people started asking, like, why are we having so many visitors all of a sudden?
Why are you here?
Why are you here? Like, where have you been all this time? And actually we had a couple tell us, we were looking for a place to connect and we found you through Facebook and just thought it was really interesting that you were talking about something. At the time we were talking about generational communication, right? And they're like, that was a really interesting idea that we didn't see anywhere else. So we started coming because that was interesting. And then we stayed because the people were really nice.
Yeah. In other areas of our lives, we understand exactly this concept, right?
Yes.
Like if you go to a new city, a new town, and you're looking for food, you open up your phone, you type in Yelp, like you're looking for great vegan restaurants, in this area. And if you're in Portland, you're going to find a bunch of those. But seldomly do you ever go to a restaurant that has 1-star reviews.
No.
And the same thing is true is that when people are looking for a community, for a faith community specifically, they're going to do the same thing. They might not go on Yelp per se, but they're going to go on the internet and check out your Facebook profile, your website, your Instagram. Are you actually doing things? And the things that you're doing, are they doing things that actually matter to me as well?
Yeah. So someone's perception is actually going to be formed by what they find online, not by what you're doing in person.
Yeah.
So
we wish it was about all that we were doing in person, because a lot of churches in this area are doing excellent work. But the reality is in order to get them through the doors, you must be building connections even before they show up.
Yeah. And I think this makes sense to us once we step outside of our own situations. If you thought about, especially if you were looking at another religion, right? If you're looking at your local church of another religion and you're saying, do I want to visit this place? What would you do? Well, you would go, you would search for pictures of what was going on. You would try to get to know the people that were there, try to get a feel for what they believe in and what they promote. And if there was no information, very likely
you're just going to go to the next one that actually has information.
You won't go because you don't know what you're going to find. And so we have the opportunity to create kind of a walkthrough of what we care about for people that they can look at from a safe distance.
Now, what I've seen some churches do, because they take this idea and they run with it and they say, oh, copy and paste 28 fundamental beliefs, put it on the website. What are your opinion on that?
No, absolutely not. I think that our beliefs should not be hidden. I think that there should be a way to find that information, but social media is primarily not informational as relational, right? It is social. Social media. Dr. Heather Thompson Day talks about the fact that social media requires us to engage person to person somehow. Because without that, it's just a billboard, right? And how often do I actually go to somewhere that I see the billboard for? Not often.
Sold.
Right. But I will go to a business that builds a relationship with me somehow, or provides an experience that I can take from looking at their content and walk through and say, I believe in that. I want to know more.
Yeah. So walk us through this. How do we actually get to the point where we're doing this? We're facilitating relationship building on the internet. Because I think most people right now, when they think of their church's online presence, it's like, well, we live stream on Saturdays.
Yeah.
And then we have an announcement on Wednesday for our live stream on Sabbath.
Yeah.
It sounds like there's many more options at our disposal right here. What would you suggest to start us off with?
So let's talk about live streaming.
Okay.
Why is it that once we move to, for example, I saw this in the first few weeks, where people were really trying to get a hang of live streaming itself. Why is the pastor still standing there with an empty church preaching as if the
People
church is there?
Right.
You don't have to, right? If the primary goal is just to communicate that information, that message, there shouldn't be a pressure to use the same methodology as when people were there looking at the pulpit. Some churches have done really well in that, it's just the pastor there. It's not necessarily suit and tie. Like, it doesn't have to be kind of one rigid replication of what was going on in a different situation. I've even seen conversational pieces start to come out where it's not just the pastor speaking directly, but actually some kind of engagement. And those seem to have worked really well. But there are several different ways, once you really start exploring like how to build community using the internet as kind of a catalyst. There are several different ways that this can look. One thing just from my local church, I attend Cross Point Adventist Church in Hillsboro, Oregon. And they've done really well at using the internet to mobilize. So there has not been a single week that I felt like just church wasn't happening. And I mean that where, not just that we had a sermon done, but I mean that the community aspect has grown actually stronger during COVID because of just the interesting and creative ways that people have found to connect. So, and it's not just the pastor, but the people there want to stay connected. They want to continue our community, and we've done that largely from our homes. Right off the bat, whatever the restrictions were for us, we observed those, but still we were part of, delivering food to people who didn't have food. We were part of, even just people individually, our musicians all recorded together to bring together like a music service. The children's story somebody records in their house, and, each of the pieces are done. And they're always bringing in new members of the church so that we're always interacting, we're always engaging. And then beyond just ourselves, there have been people who are part of buying gift cards for small businesses, for example. Like just saying, hey, we're Adventists, we care about you. This is a rough time and we're right here with you.
So I hear what you're saying, and it sounds like what most of our churches actually are doing around the country. Most of our churches are doing a children's story. They're doing a music service. They might be, helping to organize grocery runs for those who are at risk or whatever the case is. But how does this actually translate to an online content strategy for building relationships?
Sure.
Like we're doing all those things, but what does it have to do with our Facebook page?
Yeah. So I think that, this is part of our church culture that we've continued, but it should be a piece of it, right? So we always have to be thinking more than how do we continue our program into how can we be missional in our communities. I want to put out the concept that content right now is currency. So money is currency in a way that you can buy things. Relationships are currency in that as you build trust, you can rely more and more on another person. Content is currency because our messaging, the things we promote, and the support that we give are very meaningful to especially small businesses, local artists, people like that. One way that you can partner with your community beyond just inviting them to what's going on is that you can help support them through creating content. So I use the example of, if you just got your roof redone on the church, an easy way that you can support that construction company is to take a picture of your brand new roof. Just do a before and after picture and say, hey, like these people did a great job and we want to share that. And we're so thankful to share the community with them. If you have a local artist or musician, if you have a musician on your praise team, for example, that may not be connected to your church, just support them, share that they have been helpful in a way. And then, when it comes to your own membership, I think telling stories is a way to bond us with people outside the church and inside.
Yeah, because this is something that you've been doing for quite some time, telling stories of people in a local community. And I think one of the more common responses that I've seen in the comment sections is like, I go to church with that person and I never heard that story before.
Yeah.
And so being able to share the story of someone who's sitting right next to you in the pew on any other given Sabbath and actually be able to bring their experience to the forefront is a way for me to say, wow, I see that person a little bit better now and I have a stronger relational bond to them.
Yes.
And there is this sense in which I feel closer to that person by hearing that person's story.
Yeah, stories build empathy. So the same part of your brain, this is really, really interesting piece of science, that the piece of your brain, when you remember an event that happened to you in your own life, is the same part of the brain that's activated when you read someone's story. So when they say, these are the events and this is how this played out, it actually puts you in their situation and gives you a little opportunity to look around and you feel bonded to that person more than you would have otherwise. And I think this is important because the relational work with our community and with each other is so important to the success of everything we do. And so whatever we're creating has to be kind of with this mindset of we're always building and bonding to each other. And really stories create a space that we don't always have in church. There is an aspect to love and relationships that requires us to be invested in somebody, to try to know them more. And we can love them better when we know them more. So being able to read through their experience and empathize with them, it just brings us closer. And from the outside, someone's going to connect much more with the personal testimony of somebody than they are to the announcement of potluck or the theological thing going on.
I'm thinking about the types of stories that most churches want to tell and maybe feel comfortable telling. It's like, oh, I was fill in the blank vice, or I had this negative experience for 20, 30, 40 years. And then Jesus. Yeah. And then now my life is better. It's perfect. And everything's wrapped up with a nice, neat little bow. Like that might be a really great story to have every once in a while on a Sabbath sermon or whatever the case is. But what I'm seeing work on the internet isn't always just these, I was one way and now I'm completely fixed and better stories.
Yeah. We, especially in the Adventist church, we have socialized ourselves to tell this victory story, to distance ourselves from our past. And right now, I think one thing that the world really wants from religious people is day-to-day reality. They want to see the struggle.
This is what people are talking about. Like, young people want transparency. Like, okay, like that's a phrase that we hear a lot. Young people want authenticity. Yeah. Well, what does that look like? Well, real life isn't always victorious in this triumphal like manner. Sometimes like you actually deal with stuff. Yeah. And people want to have an insight into how are other people dealing with it. And the reason why is because, well, if I'm dealing with the same thing and I feel like I'm at my wit's end, I've tried 3 or 4 different solutions, but then I hear your story and it was a different solution, I might actually be able to participate in that strategy as well.
Yeah, it can be really alienating, at least judging from the experiences I've talked to people about, to be on the outside of religion and to look in, and the things people are talking about are so separate from what you're dealing with in your life, or they say, 30 years ago I had a drug problem. Well, the person with the drug problem now needs to talk to somebody who understands having a drug problem now,
So this doesn't necessarily mean that you highlight someone with a current drug problem, or is that what you're saying? Or do you say that the person who had a drug problem and has overcome, instead of just focusing on the overcoming piece, what if you focused on a story within the moment of them actually struggling?
Exactly. Yeah. I think we have to take away that pressure to distance ourselves so much, to separate an us and them, if that makes sense. We do it with ourselves. Yeah. So when we say, if someone says that I had a pornography addiction, that was in the past, I'm distant from that. I want to be as separate from that as possible. It's coming from a good place. Like, you should want to be away from bad things.
Of course. And you want to be able to say, hey, for you, there's hope for you as well. Like, you can overcome fill in the blank vice.
Yes. But I think the way that we tell these stories tends to be that I no longer relate to people going through that struggle. I am somehow ascended or better.
So give me an example. Let's say it's with the drugs and alcohol kind of a thing. What would be a type of story that you would think would work better than just, I used to be an alcoholic and then I met Jesus and now my life's better. Yeah. And I'm better than you.
I mean, I have real life examples of this from drug stories, for example. Interviewed a man who walked me through, I think it was his life at 10 or 11 years old. And just kind of the fear associated with that. He talked about, where he would be at certain times of the day and what was going on around him, and just the mindset of what it was like to live in that space. Had he instead said, 3 sentences or a couple of just like, I used to have real hard problems with drugs. And then focused all the rest on the over, like, it's fixed. Now my life is so good. God gives us this promise, and spends all their time on that piece. That's not the piece that people can relate to yet. It might be the thing that they want at the end of the story. They want to know that you can overcome. That's great. But you have to communicate that what you have experienced is something that is relatable to somebody else and what they're experiencing right now.
I think about that passage where it talks about like Jesus as someone who has been tempted in every way that we have, that Jesus is someone who actually understands what it means to be tempted. Like, there was something about what he did, is that he put on flesh and he put himself in the mess, in our mess, so that we can know, hey, there's someone here, there's a God here who relates to us, who understands what we're going through.
Yeah. And we so underestimate the real life and actionable change that happens when we connect over story. So, we interviewed one young lady about a really horrible situation where she was going through abuse at the hands of a pastor, right? And that's a hard thing to talk about. And it doesn't paint the church in a necessarily like positive light. And yet, I think it's more bonding and it builds more trust with the community to be able to own up to those experiences and issues. What I saw happen in the comment section, that person said, hey, this is my story. I just want to invite anyone who has gone through this experience to come together. Let's create something together where we can share our stories safely and we can heal from this and we can work towards something better in the future. So from just that person contributing to a Facebook and Instagram post, what happened was 5 or 6 people in the next week came together and actually had a change in the pattern of their life to create space to talk about this stuff and to heal.
Wow.
And so it's not separate from our lives. This is part of these people's journeys, and this is part of their healing process even, both with each other and with the church.
Wow. Okay. So just being able to tell these stories, I think, is one thing, and it's a skill set that needs to be developed and grown. And it's okay to like walk your way through this and try. You've done about 500, interviews so far, so you're really good at that. But maybe we're just starting that process. But I want to kind of transition from there to actually how it builds more and more community. So we're sharing stories, we're being vulnerable, we're sharing both the highs and the lows and all things in between. But how do we actually go actionably from that to building in-person community? Because at the end of the day, this is really what our churches are all about. And this is what we excel at, is doing the in-person communities. How do we get from piece of content to now we're like fellowshipping together in person?
Yeah, I think the step one, even if you have not used the internet for anything to do with your church, is just to change the mindset. Changing the mindset does so much because it opens us up to the possibilities that we can use these things for. So we have to go from seeing the internet as this kind of, side thing. If it happens, it happens, kind of just throwing our information up there and not being willing to invest time and energy into developing it, but create a long-term goal of whatever we try, using that, as a bonding thing. So how do you do that? The best way is just to start by imagining yourself as someone who is not already Adventist, who is not already part of your church. Imagine if it was another church trying to do this, what would reach you? What would engage you? There are things we engage with all the time that are from people of other religions, secular content. What draws us and why is it meaningful? If you have that mindset, then whenever you go into creating even a Zoom meeting, even some kind of get together, you do it from the mindset of not because you have to, because it's just expected, because it's just this additional thing, but how do I create it specifically for the people looking through this window of their screen? So I want to wrap up with just one short story that I love.
Okay.
And so there was way, way back when I started interviewing Adventists, there was a young man who moved to my conference, and he was from a different state, didn't know anybody, and had been following Humans of Adventism and reading the stories there. When he got to his new workplace, there was someone that he recognized.
Oh.
And so I want you to put I don't want you to miss the experience of being a young person with very little money, without knowing somebody in the community, is a very isolating one. It's a very lonely one, and can be really difficult, and I think can lead to us disconnecting with our church. If once you leave the community you've grown up with, that established bond that maybe your parents helped facilitate, without that sense of community, it can actually be really hard to create one. So I love this story because he got to his new workplace and he recognized someone and he immediately remembered reading their story. Wow. And it had been this really deeply personal thing that you wouldn't know about someone when you first meet them.
It's going to be awkward for the other person. Like, hey, I know this deep, intimate secret about your life. Like, hi, and you don't know, by the way, my name's John.
I think it was, it has the potential for that, but it just worked out well where that person was known on a deeper level, and from that very first day, my friend had someone to connect with. His real life was changed because of something he read online. And I think that when it comes to our local churches, if we could share the stories of the people inside, there's the potential for the visitor, for the newcomer, for the guest, for the person who just moved here, to actually have a bond, at least the prologue to a bond, with the people there, where they actually felt a little connected instead of like they were just risking it and like jumping out into space.
I love this idea because it solves one of the like biggest problems that I've experienced when I do public evangelism, is that you as the evangelist or as the speaker or maybe even as the pastor, you're always up front, and the focal point is the content from only the pastor or the leader who's on the stage.
Yes.
And what happens is inevitably the evangelist has to go to the next church, or somewhere down the line the pastor transfers locations, and then there's always a group of people, well, our pastor's gone, so we're going to go to a different church now. And it speaks to the fact that they weren't actually maybe bonded with the actual community in the way that they could have been.
Yes.
And it's this shift away from saying, hey, church is all about the one speaker up on the stage, but we are the church.
Yep.
You are the church, I'm the church,
Yep.
and you, if you're walking in the door for the first time, you're the church as well. And so you matter, your story matters as well. And so there's this way that, we say in evangelism, hey, if people have, 7 friends in a community, they're sticking around. They're not going to go anywhere because there's relational depth here.
Yeah. Have you noticed in the Oregon young adult community in the past 4 months, have you noticed the kind of
like shuffling of all the small groups or all the young adult groups?
Yeah, the walls have been broken down quite a bit. I think just in the time since churches went online. There's a lot less where people are just focused on their group of 15 people in their area, but now we're getting this bigger bird's eye view of the larger community and the things that we could do together if we actually decided to collaborate more, if we decided to not just focus on our one church and our one little group that we kind of have come to know, but there is a whole collective of people that care largely about the same things that we have the opportunity to engage with and build with, that's not just our local building.
And we're back right here with Justin and Kaleb in the flesh. And thank you so much for that last 25 minutes of content. That was, it gave me a lot to think about. We'll just say that.
What was the thing that you were thinking about?
Yeah.
Well, I was thinking about all kinds of things. I want to explore the idea from early on in that teaching about this idea of digital front door. But the other thing I was thinking about was, okay, so churches cultivating authenticity, but churches are made up of people.
Yeah.
And I think that one of the skills that many of us don't have is this listening ability that allows us to build connections.
Yeah, I think very few Adventists have ever been accused of being great listeners.
I think we're actually scared out of it.
Yeah.
I would say there's a lot of cultural things that we teach or tend toward that is this idea of corruption, right? Instead of like taking the time and being solid in yourself, but being willing to be open and to hear out, other people. I think this one term I heard from, my elders was creeping compromise. That like if you let a little bit of someone else in, they're going to corrupt you somehow.
Yeah, this idea that birds of a feather flock together. So be careful who you're spending time with. I know for me, has caused me to see the world as there's us, and then there's them, and be sure not to spend too much time with them because you don't want to slowly have your mind being warped or deceived. These were the kinds of words that were used oftentimes as I was growing up that caused me to separate myself from other people.
Yeah.
And I've been in conversations with too many people where you're sharing something and you can see in their eyes that they're not taking in what I'm saying. Like
so
you can see the things spinning in their eyes, like they're building their next argument.
Yeah. This is the most ironic thing about Justin and I. We both have platforms surrounding listening, and probably the most tense conversations we have is just us each going, "You're not listening to me. No, you're not listening to me."
We were on the road literally a couple days ago having one of these drag out fights and conversations and debates over things that we both care immensely about. So we understand this really matters, and I need to tell you what I believe. But when we find ourselves in those positions, we're certainly not learning, and relational bonds aren't being strengthened. They might be being broken apart. And so I think the more that we're willing to listen to someone's story, even if it contradicts what we firmly believe, there's a better outcome there.
Yep.
So in this conversation, we're really talking about a couple of different things, and I just took us in a totally different direction from what we planned. But we're talking about two things, that as a church or as believers, we're talking about cultivating a space and telling stories that demonstrate the heart and that kind of reveal this sense of authenticity, this sense of realness.
So you mentioned the new front door of the church concept. Maybe these aren't that different. Maybe the idea of a digital front door for your church is how we communicate this Christ-like spirit to what people first encounter. So let me explain this idea of the new front door. So in the old days, maybe, I don't know, because I maybe didn't live during this time, but I would imagine that more people actually tried out things without having anywhere to see first, right? So you would go to a church, you'd check it out in person. What we're seeing now is that most people, before you go to a restaurant, before you go to a church, before you go to most places, you do some research, some cursory research, just to get a feel for, like, what am I doing? What are the people there like? What's going on over there? What are their values? And me, as a lifelong Adventist, do this with other Adventist churches, right? Before I go to a new town, if I'm deciding whether to go to church that week or not, say I'm visiting a relative in some other state and I'm not familiar. Well, the first thing that I do is look up that church on Facebook, look up their website, look up Instagram presence, whatever, and say, what are the values of this church? Who's there? What am I going to find before I go in there? And I would say, even in my own experience, there have been times where I looked and I said, I don't think this church is reflecting Christ. I'm not going to go there. So it's very important that we form some kind of content, some kind of introduction to us for the searching person.
I think so many of these searching people are thinking some version of the question, will I be accepted there? Will I fit in? I know that for a lot of people, even just the standard testimonies that we hear, someone's down and out with addictions to this or that, and they're thinking, man, can I actually show up? And so it feels like this very large step of faith to be willing to put yourself out there. Here's one way that we can make that simpler, is actually featuring stories of people just like them. Jesus wasn't afraid to be called the friend of sinners. And so as a church, why are we so afraid to share the stories of people who are going through things and how we are trying to support them through that journey? It might actually be the case that by sharing these stories, people who feel really skeptical and really scared to show up in person might say, wow, if they're willing to accept that person, maybe I also will be accepted if I show up.
Yeah, absolutely. So how do you, as you're pursuing these stories, as people are opening their lives to you, is there a sense in which you look to pursue a sense of maybe optimism in that story? Or does that matter?
I don't think it's always optimism. I think it's relatability.
Okay.
So I've interviewed over 500 Seventh-day Adventists, and what I'm always pursuing is the human experience. Now, our Adventism informs our human experience, definitely. I don't try to cut God out of it, nothing like that. However, there is a common thread between all of humanity in some things that we experience. Pain, hope, right? Opportunity, disappointment, trauma. All of these things are common threads. They're bridges between people that you don't have to know the jargon of the Adventists to talk about these subjects. You don't have to have a background in theology to relate to what's going on. And so more than positivity, it's reality. It's shared reality. And from that bond that comes from taking in another person's story and putting yourself in their shoes, I think it's from there that we can start to talk about ideology and worldview and faith, because all of those things inform how we do or what we do with the realities that we have. So, if I'm living in a particularly difficult situation, if all I'm hearing is theology that doesn't seem to connect with this difficult situation, I don't have time for it, right? But if I know that somebody of this faith also struggles with, that same thing, or they've been through the same thing, I don't have to share that faith yet, to have something to be drawn to them even.
And it doesn't even have to be only negatively motivated. Like, oh, they struggle with the same things that I'm struggling with. It could also be they care about the same things that I care about. And I think that this is one of those areas that we're seeing a lot of growth in the Adventist community when we see, social justice issues. I know that here in this conference, the one thing that has been dramatically revolutionary, at least from our opinion as young adults and just seeing the conversations taking place online, the stances at this conference has said, you know what, we want to stand with people. We want to listen to the stories of individuals who have been systematically silenced or even just downright abused. When we show up and we can demonstrate that we do care, other people are saying, wow, I didn't know that they cared about that. It causes them to wrestle with this caricature of what does it mean to be a follower of Jesus.
Yeah, absolutely. So somebody commented online, and I'm trying to put it in context, but what's interesting, the comment on YouTube says, I'm uncomfortable if the church new front door is demonstrating something different than what you find when you show up.
Ooh, yeah, absolutely. So there's work to be done there, right? If you have an unfriendly church and the person on social media is presenting this very friendly picture, it's not enough to do false advertising, basically. There's also some things that you have to, get through to create cultural change.
Yeah, and we're not trying to suggest that storytelling or social media just in general is this magic bullet. Do this, it fixes everything. No, it just, really what social media is a magnifying glass on what already is. If your church has a great culture and is a place that's accepting and warm and does genuinely care about people and the things that people are going through, then adding a social media strategy is going to help all those people in your area who really would feel great at home here. They're going to just find it more quickly. If your church is the kind of church that just someone comes in and within 24 hours they're gone, they're not even interested again, that problem is only going to be magnified.
Jonathan, Lori Lasher just shared something that I don't want to miss. She says, sharing that your church has a grief recovery class, divorce support group, etc. These are important. What I would like to suggest is that more than just putting the static information, that those are there. Let's take the divorce support group, right? Okay, sharing the story of somebody that says, look, I went through a messy divorce and this is what it was like. I hit rock bottom. I hit this point in life where I was so fed up and frustrated. And this is how the divorce support group helped. That is so much more powerful than just putting this distant announcement that you have one, but sharing what it does for somebody, right? Sharing why did somebody even come to your church in the first place, right? Is it because they were born there? Is it because they just moved to a new town? What attracted them? What are the meaningful experiences that they've had? Because when you share those things, I think that people are more likely to say, oh, like maybe I could have an experience like that there.
So let's take another step into the digital front door. So we use these authentic stories, these human experiences to show that there are relatable people that are in this church. What else are people looking for when they come to my church website or when they come to my social media presence to give a sense of what's going on?
What else are people looking for besides stories?
Yeah.
I think that a good amount of people look for what you stand for. And on the topic of social justice, for example, the sad reality is that a lot of churches are not safe places for minorities, women, LGBT brothers and sisters. Like, if you're in any of these positions, you're going to be searching beyond what are the platitudes, right? And looking for, like, okay, if I show up, like, do they even want me there? Do they even want me there? If I'm not convinced that God exists even, am I allowed to come to church? And the posture that we hold and the way that we go about creating content matters a lot in signaling whether that person is wanted or whether we would be repulsed by them.
It reminds me of something that my English teacher taught me in high school, this concept of show, don't tell. This idea of it's not just it's one thing to say that we are a church for all people. You're welcome here, or welcome to your new home. Like these kinds of phrases that are meant to, in a pithy way, communicate that you want people to show up. It's another thing to actually tell the story of someone who wasn't sure if they would be welcome, and the very fact that they were.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, words are cheap, right?
Yeah.
It's easy to put a slogan on a website.
Yeah.
But to be able to show that people belong is much more powerful.
You earn the right to use the words, right? If you're showing that you are out there day to day, living among the people, serving them, acting on their behalf, showing God's love to them, if you're showing that, the words aren't empty.
And I would even go a step further. Maybe the words aren't empty, but it's always better if someone else is talking about how good you are.
Yes.
If you're like, man, we're great, we're the friendliest church. Okay, cool. Maybe that's convincing on a certain level. But when you can have someone who's kind of the outsider, say, man, these people were some of the nicest people. When I first showed up, I met Joe. And Joe and his wife invited me to their home, and we had a great meal and great and you can actually talk about, and they're sharing how amazing the church reception was. Then, that's all you need. This is why, on Amazon or any other website or Yelp or things like that, it's all about user reviews. You do not intentionally get food poisoning. No one goes to Yelp and says, oh, what's the 1-star rating? No, you're looking for testimonies. You're looking for photos, and not just the beautiful, clearly professional photos where it paints a picture of what they want you to think. We all watch the McDonald's commercials. You've never been to McDonald's and saw what you saw in the commercial,
No.
Of course.
So we're wanting to see the realness of what's happening in person. And this is where the stories come. This is where the testimonies matter.
Certainly. So I want to pivot just a little bit. We've been talking kind of about the strategy of what all this means, how it works and whatnot. One of our Facebook viewers asked the question, how can we individually as people connect more authentically as the church on social media?
Oh, I guess my first answer would be you don't even have to start in social media. What happens through social media is largely a reflection of what happens in the actual church community. So where we can start is actually being that person, being the person who greets the new person who's walking in the door, and not just a handshake greet, or certainly not during coronavirus times, but not just that. They're like, hey, we're glad you're here. We want to welcome you, and anything you need, let us know, and then go sit somewhere else. Like actually being the part of that change.
I think so. It was probably 4 years ago now. I was listening to a podcast with a pastor that I follow, Garrison Hayes, and he was talking about racism, and he said, a lot of people really need to adopt the attitude of a learner instead of a teacher. And I think that this translates into relationships outside the church so well, in that in order to be more authentic, you need to show interest in somebody, right? We have a tendency to outsource things, throw Bible verses at people, push them off onto articles, all of these different things that take us out of the moment of building a relationship with somebody. And what I think we can do better is, instead of trying to force an opinion, instead of trying to push things on them, is to spend our time just taking in their perspective. I think in past, what is the quote from Daryl Davis? When I actively listen, I passively teach. Something like that. When I actively listen, I passively teach people about me. There's an amount of trust that's built. There's an amount of respect that's built when you give the microphone over to the other person, when you give them the space to communicate, and then you demonstrate that you're hearing them and that you're truly processing the meaning that they're putting into their words.
In the ministries that we get to collaborate, one of kind of our maybe not catchphrases, but one of our ideals and one of the things that we stand for is this concept of slow to speak and quick to listen. It's on this shirt.
I don't know if you can see
it. There it is.
I was reminded of that. And it's this posture that really is challenging for us, but really makes the biggest difference. There's a barber that I would go to for the last year and a half here in Portland. And what did church look like in that moment? It looked like me sitting in a barber chair listening to him for over a year, talking about his relationships and the challenges that he was going through, being in a broken family and trying to raise their shared son, and being in a new relationships and his spiritual challenges and his journeys. It looks a lot like listening. It looks a lot like caring enough to shut your mouth for a moment to actually give them the platform.
So I want to actually lean into that a little further.
Yeah.
Because you're talking about this. This is the life that you live. Mm-hmm. There may be viewers with us right now that are like, oh, yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. That makes sense. And they're going to go and listen to somebody. But the challenge is there is a certain skill set of listening that I can come into a space with the best of intentions and be the worst listener in the world. You can just ask my wife about that. I can come home and I want to engage in her world. And there's a certain set of skills that if I don't come home with that ready to go, I'm not good. So talk to us about what that looks like, what that feels like. Let's get even down to a closer level.
I think before talking about the specifics of the skill set, because when we talk about it as listening as a skill set, it's easy to feel like, well, I'm not skilled at that. And the reality is I, Justin Khoe, am not skilled at that. This is actually why my whole show's emphasis right now, the show is called I'm Listening, because it's a recognition that I am actually quite terrible at it. I want to get better at it because I've seen the power of what it does to people's hearts and how it actually opens doors for the gospel to come in and to take root. And so I think it's maybe somewhat less about mechanics and strategies and the different things that you could do, and it's more about a posture and it's about a heart attitude. It looks like me telling Kaleb, which is a real conversation that I had this last week, hey Kaleb, I'm not great at listening. And so when this shows up and you're there, maybe it's with a conversation with you and I, or you're just witnessing a conversation, I give you full permission to kind of just give me the look, and I'll immediately know what that means. And sometimes he actually has to use the words. He did use the words, unironically, with my wife. My wife and I are having a conversation. I should say, I'm having a conversation with my wife because I'm not listening to her. And then Caleb's like, "You're doing it," and I'm like, "Oh, thank you. Go ahead." Sometimes
that
it's
is fantastic.
So few people will actually do that, though. They'll say they're interested, but so few people will be like, I am not ashamed in you saying this and pointing out something I actually want to grow. I actually want to be better. One thing that, my little church, so I left the church for a while. A lot of people are familiar with my story, but my church demonstrated to me before I even came to that church that they wanted to hear me. And this is the biggest draw that my little country, mostly elderly church had for me, is that their entire posture was, we want to hear you. That's it. We just want to know about you. We want to know your world. We want to ask you questions, and we're going to disagree a lot. But over and over and over, no matter how heated those conversations got, the membership spent the time to just say, hey, whether we come to the same conclusion or not, I'm going to ask you questions because your input matters to me and your mind matters to me. So the skill set of listening starts with intentionality. It doesn't mean that you're good at it right away, but it starts with a desire, right? Because we all have embedded in us the desire to be known. Right? And it's actually at odds with the other people's desire to be known. We each want to be known, and that's why we speak so much. That's why we put so much out into there, because we really want to be known and accepted and loved for who we are, and we feel like the only way to do that is to tell people what we think, to tell people what's going on in our heads.
I'm a great listener.
So
does it work like that? No, it's through action.
So you give a gift to someone when you create the opportunity for them to tell you, right? You create a gift for someone when you're like, I'm going to put my desire to be known on the back burner for now, and I'm going to give you the chance to be known. I'm going to give you the chance I'm going to ask you about your life. I'm going to care about where you're coming from and consider the things that you say.
Something that the Oregon Conference that has been doing for the last couple of years has been doing intentional listening conversations. I know that at the pastoral level, this is something that has happened on a few occasions where all the pastors are gathering together, and we invite, maybe through Craigslist, we'll give you $100 for an hour of your time if you're a non-Christian to come in and on stage, which is a huge ask. But actually to say, hey, what is your view of church? What is your view of God? And what is your view of how we treat the ostracized in the community? And give these people the opportunity opportunity to just literally share and not even respond, because they might say some really challenging things. They might say some hurtful things. But part of what it is to be a leader is to clearly define reality. This is something that Ben Lundquist says a lot in the whole growing young movement. If you want to be the kind of church where young people feel welcome to, is like you have to start with listening. You have to start with, okay, really, where are we as a church? You young person, you left the church 5 years ago. Why did you leave? Yeah. And ask many people these questions, and you'll actually start to learn a lot about yourself as a community. Oh, you're right. Maybe that actually is a very good reason. Yeah. Maybe if I was in your position, I too would be challenged with the idea of being a part of this physical community. And because of you've held up the mirror to what we look like and what we sound like and what we're doing, now we have the opportunity to say, that's not good enough. We're going to do better. Man, you guys are just bringing the wisdom today. I do not want this session to end at all. Thankfully, we do have a few more minutes. So we started with social media, and now we're into humanity. Mm-hmm. We're talking about this thing that happens when you put yourself aside for a moment and enter into the world of somebody else. Yeah. And I know from experience how refreshing that is. I mean, we have stuff coming at us all the time, as humans in this world that we live. And, it was a few months ago, Kaleb, that you came and sat in my office and was like, it's your turn. And I'm like, what do you mean? Like, I have phone calls to do. I have things to say. I have people to listen to. I have all of this. And that moment when you sat across the table from me and you just sat and listened was just such a breath of fresh air in my world, in the insane pace of everything I do. Just to have that moment where somebody actually cares about my journey, my story, my history, it was game-changing for me.
I would say this is the major part of my ministry. I don't talk about my ministry much, in that I see myself much more as maybe a journalist or something like that. But the ministry of presence and the ministry of listening, by interviewing, 4 people every week, I spend a lot of my time just opening up space for them that wouldn't be opened up otherwise. I use the illustration of if you're walking down a sidewalk and you've just been walking for a long time and you're tired, how many of us just sit on the ground? Nobody. Almost nobody sits on the ground, right? You walk until you find a space designated for you to sit on. And that's the same with sharing our stories, is that somebody has to create that space. And a lot of us are tired of walking and we need the bench. A lot of us haven't had that space created for us. Some people ever. Some people have never had somebody do this for them. And in taking this time constantly on a weekly basis, by going around our conference and reaching into the pockets of humanity that we have here in Oregon and then beyond, we're actually showing people that you don't have to be a pastor to matter. Mm-hmm. You don't have to be have an online presence to matter. You don't have to be young to matter, right? You matter, and your story matters, and we want to hear it. Maybe this is going a step too far, but I think that when we listen, we're actually giving people an experience of Sabbath. The world says you must do something in order to matter. You need to perform at work. You need to do all these things in order for us to pay attention to you. The art of listening is simply about who you are right now is enough. Yeah. And my attention is how I prove that you are enough right now. And as you're saying, it was game-changing. It was a burden off your shoulder when someone just simply listened. When we show up to people who feel like they're not enough, who feel like they're not the right kind of person, or they haven't done the right things, when you sit and listen and you give them the respect of your presence and listening, you give them an experience of what it means to be to Sabbath. That with God, we're already enough, so they don't have to do anything extra. Just who they are right there in that moment is enough. And that's such an important point. If God's people in the Oregon Conference were to take on the mantle, to take on the responsibility of creating that space for even one person per week, what would our territory be like? We would have the true experience of church, right? And I think, man, my heart is heavy for this, because imagine a local church where you walk in and people care about more than what you're wearing, about more than whether you read the Sabbath school lesson or not, but you walk into a space where you truly feel like, wow, the people here, no matter where I've been this week, no matter what's happening, genuinely care for me, and I genuinely care for them. I think this is a missing piece of church in 2020. This is a desperately needed piece of church, and I think people of all ideologies, all backgrounds would flock to this attitude, and through that we show Christ. Through that, people would say, I don't know, how you came to all of these conclusions, but I sure know what you're doing, and I sure believe in what you're doing, and I want more of that.
No question. No question. I want to see if we can bring this full circle a little bit, because what we're talking about seems like it's easier when we can sit across the table from each other and share, a dessert or a meal or something, a coffee if you're into that thing. That seems like the natural way we do it here. Okay, let's bring it back to online. We are all locked in our homes.
Yeah.
Social media is a place where everybody is lobbing these bombs at each other, wanting to tear down anybody else that doesn't think like I do. Yeah. Okay, how do we take this heart, this posture, as you said, and unfold it in the lives of the people in our circle online?
The way that people have ministered to me, I've learned from the way I've been ministered to. And I remember, someone coming across, my car had broken down, and someone from across the country sent me a message on Facebook and said, hey, I don't know, what your financial situation is or anything, but I want you to know that I listened to your experience today, and I'm sending you $50. It wasn't going to fix my car with $50, but it was so meaningful to me because they used what they had to reach out across the country to me and just say, hey, this mattered to me. Or even if you're online and you're watching this content, right, or you're watching somebody's video or you're reading their post and something sticks with you, tell people. Tell people. It's free. It's easy. Just say, hey, maybe we don't know each other well, but I just want you to know that you posted something that mattered to me and your voice is valuable. If you're reaching out, it is so easy that I almost think that we don't understand the value of that, right? It's so cheap. And even if we just took the time each day to say, I'm going to send one meaningful message to somebody, right? It doesn't matter if it's your grandma, your grandkid. It doesn't matter if it's somebody you barely know, but just say, hey, I've seen you at church, or I've seen you in this place, or whatever your connection is. It doesn't have to be complicated, right? Just say, like, I just want you to know you matter, right? And I just want you to know that, like, if you ever need anything, I'll help however I can.
Powerful. How does that work with our church programs, with our, so individually as Christians, we can do that directly.
Yeah.
Okay. In COVID context, we're still in this content mill, whether it's micro content or longer content, whatnot. How can we bring these strategies together, so to speak? How do we demonstrate this posture with our church?
I think it's by actually going about and doing that. There are people in your local community that are suffering, whether that's because of health, that's because of loneliness, that's because of a mental illness, that's because they're actually hungry. What does it look like for us to intentionally go look for those people? Sure, there's people in our walls and we need to absolutely minister to us, for sure. There's value in inreach, but what would it look like for us to actually to be keeping our eyes open for those kinds of people? What if instead of pulling up at the exit of the freeway and simply turning the other way when someone's out there saying they're hungry, what would it look like to carve out, intentionally going to that same exit every single day, getting to know that person, even in 30-second intervals, getting to know their story and helping them when we can. I think that would do something. I think this is the beauty of what our friends over at Tell Them Creatives and Fusion Ministries in San Bernardino, Jasper Tiriaga and Bo Kim, they're doing a homeless ministry. And at the beginning, they're giving out hundreds of meals every single day. And so it was all about how many people can we feed? Because the thing that we want to be able to say is we fed 1,000 people. what they quickly found out was that that wasn't the most important thing that they were doing, because other church ministries were also coming through, and people literally even told them, we already have enough food. So what they said is, instead of going to 10 areas, we're going to go to 4 areas instead. And instead of just drop and go, like in some churches that because of COVID, their strategy was, hey, stay over there. I'm going to come, drop the food on the ground. I'm going to walk away, and then you can come and get the food. We're not saying that you wanted to completely disregard COVID, but what they decided to do with Fusion Ministries was, you know what, instead of going to 10 locations, we're going to go to 4. And instead of just trying to get there quickly, we're going to spend intentionally 30, 45 minutes in every location. And instead of just giving them something to eat, I'm going to give them food, sure, but I'm going to sit there and eat with the person. And the simple starting fact of saying, now I actually know your name. And next time I come, I actually continue to remember your name and to hear your stories. They've been seeing baptisms every single week of coronavirus simply because they're not just showing up and quote unquote doing the work, but they're actually building community. They're building this relational depth, and they're actually sitting there with the posture of a listener, actually listening.
I remember taking it fully digital. I remember a creative platform doing something that blew my mind really early when I came back to church. And what they did was they created a focus group completely of non-Christians. And so they said, hey, this is what we're creating. We would like people who don't believe like us to give us some feedback. And their question wasn't, do you agree theologically with us? It was, how do you see this impacting the world? You know, what is the posture of our church? What is the honest feedback of like us existing? What is the impact we make? And to some people, they can believe that maybe Christianity is ideologically wrong and still believe it's beneficial. You know, if we are acting on behalf of the suffering, if we are helping, they can still have a positive view of us. But there are also people who view, you know, Christians and Christianity as actively harmful. And in some cases, they're both correct, you know, depending on what your interaction has been. But that act of saying, like, we know for sure you don't believe like us, and we still value your opinion, you know, and they did it all online. They were just like, hey, we want your honest feedback. We're not going to argue. We're just going to ask honest questions because we want to know what the impact is that we're doing. And in doing this, I wish we did it more with even community service, right? Because there are so many church groups who, like in homeless ministry, go throw food out, make themselves feel good, and are they actually connecting with the community? Are they actually bonding with them? Are they actually building up the people? Maybe not. You know, but if you took the time to get to know the people, you would understand the nuance and complexity of their needs, and be able to speak a lot better to those.
Wow. Drop in wisdom. So I want you to just dream a little bit with me. What would it look like? What would the world look like if Seventh-day Adventists, everybody within the sound of our voice, were to take on this mantle?
Yeah.
To listen and to be real and to hold space for the people in their circles. What would happen if all of us said, we're in?
You know, I think it's in the book of Isaiah. You might be able to correct me if I'm wrong. There's this picture of a community that has the light, and this light is so undeniable. It's so attractive that people who are outside of the community come flocking and say, "What is it? What is it that you have? Because we want it." I think when we listen, I think that when we demonstrate ourselves to truly be people who are transformed by the power of Christ, and it's this potent thing, I don't think that we're going to be able to stop people from coming. I don't think, if our message is always, we're great, we're better than everybody, our ideas are right, you should believe like us, I think there's only a small subsection of people that we're ever going to attract. But if we demonstrate ourselves to be people of the light, I just can't imagine a world where that doesn't reach people's hearts.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, I mean, this is the ideal church I'm working toward to see on this earth. Is I have this constant scene from Jesus' life that is always, always, always in my mind. And that's just Jesus sitting with the outcasts of society, Jesus personally sitting and eating with them. And to the point where like he was really, really judged and hated for the people he was around. And my ideal vision for the church, and I think if we took this seriously, Jonathan, is that when people hear the word Seventh-day Adventist or Christianity or Christ follower, the response, the inner response that they have is those are safe people. Those are people who care for me, right? Not necessarily that's who I agree with, but if I am in need, if I am down and out, if I am hitting rock bottom and there's no one in my life here for me, the Adventists are. The Christians are, the Christ followers are. And I don't know that that's the perception of our church. And I think, sadly, in some ways we've earned the reputation we have, but we have an opportunity now to build something else. And that is the ideal that I would love to see, is that when somebody drives by an Adventist church, whether they go in or not, whether they do the theological study or not, they know that place, their hearts are for me.
You know, I absolutely appreciate and respect each of you for what you're doing and for the way that you are bringing the heart of humanity to social media and doing your best to shine and to share and to be the hands and feet of Jesus in this incredibly complicated space. As we close up today, I'm going to put you on the spot for a second.
Oh boy.
I'm going to actually, maybe it's less putting you on the spot and more giving you an opportunity. I want you, Kaleb, to just look into that camera over there, and I want to give you a minute to just say whatever you want to your church from your perspective. I want to give you a moment just to speak to the Seventh-day Adventist Church in Oregon.
Yeah. If I could encourage my church or tell them anything, I would say, look at the attraction of creatives and young people to our conference and ask yourself why. Because there is a massive issue that we're dealing with young people leaving the church, and we seem to be starting to reverse that process. It's not by accident. It's not. There are actionable steps that have been taken in order to reverse that process. And I think that this is such a dire need for Seventh-day Adventists, is that taking this posture of listening, taking this posture of empowerment and risk is not only Christ-like, but it's also the only way to survive as a church. So that's, if I can say anything, it's not going to be about the methodology of social media, but the heart that should outpour into whatever tool you use. And that's the heart that I would love to see and have seen, and I just want to thank my conference for that.
Thank you, Kaleb. Justin, I want to give you the same opportunity. That your camera is over in the dark somewhere that way.
Somewhere in that general direction.
Somewhere in that general direction. I want to give you a minute just to say what you want to say to your church family here in the Oregon Conference.
One of the things that I love so much about the Oregon Conference, there's many things I love about my conference, and this is a privilege to say this because it hasn't always been true. I don't think in every stage of my Adventist journey I could even think of things to say that I love about my home conference. One of the many things that I love about my home conference is this is a place where I've seen the transforming power of the gospel. This message that says who you are right now is enough. That it's not about what you've done or will do, about what you don't do, or what theological beliefs you assent to, but your identity first and foremost is as a child of God. And there's nothing that you can do to shake that off of you, that you are created with a very image of God inside of you, and that God is for you. And because of that transforming gospel, it's caused me to begin to see people differently. And I think that's the only way I've been able to step into this phase of like, well, how do I get around this idea of like, I don't want to be associated with the others or with the sinners or fill in the blank. It's this revelation that we are not, our identity is not based off of what we do or say or even believe. It's an immutable fact that we're created in God's image and that we matter to Him. And because of that, it changes the way that not only do we see ourselves, but it changes the way that we see others. And now that's what gives me the stamina or the patience to say, you know what, you first. Tell me about your life, because it truly, like, it's no longer about me posturing and saying, I'm better, my ideas are right and yours are wrong. It's no, you're created in God's image. And if there's a way that I can help you to feel that and to experience that, even if it's just me being silent and listening, I want to be about that. And so I'm so grateful for the Oregon Conference for creating space for creative work with what Kaleb said, absolutely. But I'm just so grateful for just the clear proclamation of gospel here.
Thank you for that. I know that you, in this COVID context, you both are more in demand than you ever have been. And so I'm so thankful that you were willing to spend an afternoon with us, to be able to share your hearts, to share some great teaching. We feel honored that you are able to stop by. So.
It's a privilege to be here.
Absolutely.
It really is.
Absolutely.
And again, we did this in the last session. I just want to pour out my heartfelt gratitude to everyone behind the scenes. There's a lot of people who have advocated and who have lobbied and shifted budgets around to make it so that young people and creatives and like the whole thing, thank you. It matters a lot.
Yeah.
All right. And that brings us to the end of this session. We've been through this. It seems like an appropriate time to pray for our community.
Sure.
To pray that this idea of listening and pouring into other people would take hold. Would either of you, I don't want to put you on the spot, but would either of you feel comfortable saying a prayer like that right now?
Sure.
Awesome. Let's pray for our family.
Dear God, thank you for the opportunity to come together, even virtually. This doesn't take away the value of connecting. And just thank you for another opportunity to do that, both to each other and hopefully far, far beyond our church. Thank you for loving us like you do, and just for giving us the opportunity to interact with other human beings and to hopefully work on their behalf. Please bless and guide us and help us to really process the things that we've talked about today and convict us wherever we can grow. Thank you for your love. In your name, amen.
And God in heaven, I add to that prayer that you will send your Spirit to be upon every person within the sound of this message, that together we can be those who listen, who create space, who create Sabbath in the lives of others. Lord, may we be a revolution of the Spirit of God. In the name of Jesus we pray. Amen.
Amen.